Welcome back to the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. When we turn to the Bible to understand justice, we see a thread that stretches throughout Scripture from beginning to end. We turn our attention today to the end, both figuratively and literally, with a look at the book of Revelation. Many scholars have determined that John does not address justice in the book of Revelation. But what our guest today found is that, while John may not have addressed the idea as explicitly as Jesus did in the Beatitudes, or as James did in his book, John's critique of the Roman Empire calls out a system of injustice that stands counter to the kingdom of God. That guest is Dr. David Mathewson. Dr. Mathewson is Associate Professor of New Testament at Denver Seminary in Littleton, Colorado. He has written numerous books and articles on the book of Revelation, and has a commentary on Revelation coming out within the year. Dave is married and resides in Littleton. Revelation is a book that I can't even pretend to have a full grasp on, but I found Dr. Mathewson's essay in the book The Bible and Social Justice incredibly insightful, and I eagerly anticipated having this discussion with him to try and wrap my head around the book a little more. My hope today is that you'll gain some more insight as well. Through this conversation, you'll learn more about how to approach Revelation, how John speaks against systemic injustice in the Roman Empire, and what you can apply from John's wake-up call to the churches of his day to move toward a complete, just Christian witness. Now, if you will, join me for this conversation with Dr. David Mathewson. My name's Eric, and this is the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. Our conversation will begin right after this. The Biblical Justice Resources podcast is supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and helping to resource individuals and the church for the pursuit of biblical justice, please consider giving today at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. Again, visit patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources to help support the podcast. Now on with the show. Dr. Mathewson, thank you for joining me here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
As I just told you before we got started here, I was at Denver Seminary where you teach, but we did not cross paths while I was there. We were there at the same time, but so it's good to actually get to talk to you now, and not in person. I almost said talk to you in person. talk to you here.
Yeah.
But,
over Zoom.
Yeah.
Good.
But we're going to be talking about something I think that is maybe confusing for a lot of people, is certainly confusing for me, and that's the book of Revelation. And I read through it in advance of this conversation. I was like, I'm trying my best. So I think my first question for you is, with the book of Revelation, just how do we think about the book itself? How do we approach the book of Revelation as readers?
Well, one key, I think, is, there's several, but I think the first one is to treat it like you would, at one level, any other New Testament book. So other New Testament books like Galatians, we ask, who was Paul? Who were the Galatians? Who were the Judaizers? What problem were they facing? And we try to read the book and interpret it in light of its original setting and, what the readers would have understood, what the author was trying to accomplish. And it's just amazing to me how often we don't do that when we come to the book of Revelation. But I think that should be sort of at the forefront of our thinking is, what was John trying to do, and who were the first readers in the first century, these seven churches that you read about in chapter 2 and 3, and what would they have made of the book? What was it trying to communicate to them in their setting? Before we ask questions, how does that relate to 21st century concerns? So that's one among several things, but I think a very important one that's often overlooked is ask some of the same questions you do any other New Testament book. about the historical background and the culture of the day and who the original readers were, what the book was trying, what needs or crises was it trying to address in the first century. How was John doing that? And then there's other things like what kind of literature is this? I think one of the biggest hurdles with Revelation is with a lot of most of the other New Testament books, we have more or less parallels in our literature today. I mean, we read and maybe write biographies and history and narrative, maybe not just like the Gospels and Acts, or we read or write letters, usually emails, but I still get paper letters in the mail, especially when someone's serious. They'll send you a paper letter. But when's the last time you read or wrote something that looked like the book of Revelation? So the extra hurdle is then trying to come to grips with what kind of literature is this, and how does that affect the way we should read and interpret it? So those are just a couple things I think that need to be at the forefront of our thinking when we approach this book.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably touch on most, if not all, of those things here in the
Sure.
conversation. But maybe we can start with that last point there with the literature. What what is Revelation, and why did John write it the way he did?
Yeah, basically, Revelation, first of all, belongs to a type of literature that, as I've already said, we're probably not as familiar with. But in the first century, they would have been, I think, very familiar when they opened up the book or when they heard it read to them, which is how they would have, the first readers would have heard it read, and they read a revelation of Jesus Christ. They would have understood what was coming. Is the book of Revelation is basically a record, a written account of someone's visionary experience, in this case, John's. And it's a vision that's meant to communicate a message to the readers through the form of a vision that will impact them, I think, in a greater way sometimes than just straightforward speech. And by communicating through vision, and the other key, uh, as a vision, and scholars today call it an apocalypse. But as an apocalypse or as a record of a vision, it communicates through symbols and images or metaphorical language. And that's kind of the genius of this book that you kind of have to get used to. Is it's just full of all kinds of images and symbols. It's full of metaphor. Yes, it's referring to real people and places and events, but it describes them through images that just has a more powerful way of communicating and impacting the reader. So I think because of the crisis that the readers were facing, uh, John gives God gives John a vision that's meant to address the unique situation they faced in the first century. And these images and symbols in this form of this vision that John has is meant to address the situation that the first century readers are facing. So that's a little bit about the kind of book it is. It's an apocalypse just simply means it's a record, a written account of someone's visionary experience, John's in this case, or Daniel in the Old Testament, or Ezekiel, and parts of the book of Zechariah are visionary, a record of someone's vision. But and again, these visions are communicated in highly metaphorical or symbolic language that's meant to help the reader see their situation in a new light and in a more powerful way than maybe just straightforward speech wouldn't.
Yeah, I had a conversation with Dr. Carroll a couple weeks ago about
Hmm.
the prophets, and he
Yeah.
mentioned that there's a lot of parallel connection between a lot of the prophetic literature and Revelation, which I think led to a question for me is that this is not necessarily a strictly Jewish audience. There would have been Gentiles
Hmm.
like continuing to roll into the people of God at this point.
Hmm.
And so you mentioned that they would have been familiar with this type of literature, but it seems like there are a lot of references to the prophets that maybe the Gentile audience wouldn't be as familiar with as a Jewish audience, perhaps. Is that true? Like, what sort of connections would the audience have been familiar with, both in that literature wise? Like, are there examples? What other examples are there of this type of literature at the time? But then the actual
Hmm.
specific connections to the Old Testament.
Yeah, and you're right. There are. John is heavily indebted in. So I believe he has a real vision, but he records it and interprets it in light of Old Testament texts that he's familiar with, like Daniel, Isaiah, Ezekiel, etc. And it's for me, it's hard to know, and I haven't looked into it enough to know, how and to what extent would the readers have known the Old Testament? Would they have known it through association with the synagogue? There are a couple of the letters to the seven churches in chapters 2 and 3 where the church seems to be under fire by the Jewish synagogue. So would they have had some association with the synagogue? That they would have known many of these texts. But the main thing for me is, however they would have come to know it, John does seem to write expecting his readers to have some knowledge of the Old Testament. The fact that he alludes to it, so it just weaves its language and images in. Uh, I would suspect, though, just like today, there's various levels of knowledge of the Bible in our churches. Probably the same was true that, not every reader would have picked up every last reference to the Old Testament. And there may be of some that John would have included that most would not have picked up on. I don't think that would have kept them from understanding the book at all. But it certainly there would have been another level and layer of understanding the book, being able to sort out the Old Testament references and understanding that. So that's kind of a roundabout way of saying, for me, it's difficult, I think, to know exactly the knowledge of the Old Testament that a lot of the readers, and you're right, it's basically in chapter 2 and 3, these are seven churches ensconced in Greco-Roman society and culture, and they would have been largely a non-Jewish audience. But John still writes in a way that he expects at least some of them will pick up some of his Old Testament references. Otherwise, you wonder why, unless, some have said John's so steeped in the Old Testament, it just came out. Maybe, but it's just so prolific. And for example, the book of Ezekiel, John alludes to Ezekiel almost in the exact order in which you find John follows the same order that Ezekiel does in the places where John refers to him. So it seems more intentional than John is just conscious, or he's unconsciously aware of his use of the Old Testament. He seems to consciously, a lot of times, be consciously following the Old Testament and expects that at least some of his readers will be able to pick up on that as well.
Yeah. And it strikes me, to some of what you just said, what another thing Dr. Carroll also mentioned is just that there are, like, the Old Testament functioned as scripture long before the time of Christ. This still would have been their scripture, I guess.
That's right.
It just does seem like the way that Jews were brought up on all of that scripture as young people would, I don't know what the right word is, but would seem to have them more readily available or readily possible to understand what was happening in that way.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Because it would seem like a lot of the Gentiles are not coming to that as like their cultural tradition at that point in history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's all interesting. I want to get into what this crisis is that they're addressing, because so as I said to you, I read a essay of yours I've got the book here, The Bible and Social Justice, and you made it sound like in your essay that some of the churches may not have understood that there even was a crisis present. What is the crisis, and how aware of it would the churches have been at the time?
Yeah, and the major section of Revelation that we go to figure out, what was the crisis, if there was one, what was going on. There's been a lot of debate as to what was the nature of the problem, but it's chapters 2 and 3 where you find 7 prophetic messages. Those aren't really letters. We often call them letters to the 7 churches. They're not letters at all. They're prophetic proclamations or prophetic messages to the churches. And those messages do uncover to some degree what the apparent problem was. And that, and from what we know about the cult, the location of the churches and what was going on in those cities from other sources, uh, it appears that a couple things were going on. Not, well, the basic issue was I think, to just summarize it in simple terms, is these seven churches were struggling with what it meant to live out their faithful witness in a hostile culture and world, which was the Roman Empire. The seven churches were, as John himself says, they were at the heart of the Roman province of Asia Minor, which was one of the most significant provinces. Most of the cities, they had different temples to pagan gods. They had different altars to pagan gods. Most of them had shrines or altars or temples in honor of the emperor for emperor worship. So it seems that Christians were confronted with this. And one interesting thing that Revelation seems to overturn, a common misconception, one that I always heard growing up. Revelation is a book written to comfort persecuted Christians. And when you read the letter, I just committed that mistake, letters, the messages of the seven churches, only two of the churches are being persecuted or suffering some kind of persecution, whether ostracism or verbal abuse or something like that for their faith. The other five are in danger of some level of compromise with the world. And you get to the last one, Laodicea, they are so far gone. The message has nothing good to say about that church. They have so compromised with the pagan world and their pagan Roman surrounding. So Revelation, I think, is basically written then to comfort those churches that are suffering for their faithful witness in a pagan world, but then to shock out of their complacency those churches that have compromised with their pagan surroundings. And so I think Revelation's message is kind of twofold in that regard. And as I said, I think some of those churches that were compromising, yeah, they may not have recognized that we're compromising. And so that's why I said it's Revelation for some of them may have been kind of a wake-up call to say, no, there's a real crisis in front of you. And it's a call for them to maintain their faithful witness no matter what consequences it might bring in that kind of hostile environment they're living in.
Yeah. Even as you're talking, I can't help but start to draw parallels to today and the way
Mm-hmm.
things work. I don't want to get there yet. I want to acknowledge though that
Good.
that we likely will, but just
Right.
because things as I was reading through the book and not just now hearing your response, not just the book you had your essay in, but at the actual book of Revelations, like it seems like we have a lot of connections between today and what was
Oh
happening
yeah.
then.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
it does seem like there is some sort of difference of a kind in a way. And one
Mm-hmm.
of the things that comes to mind with that is the emperor worship itself. I think
Mm-hmm.
we can maybe understand like people having other gods that they were worshiping at the time. I don't know if we necessarily understand the human person of the emperor declaring himself a deity and being worshipped as a deity. What
Right.
is that
Right.
like? What would we miss as modern day readers about what emperor worship was?
Yeah, because I mean, I think a lot of Revelation, maybe a lot of it consciously, maybe some of it unconsciously, John was challenging the claims of the Roman Empire to basically idolatry. So this, uh, yeah, you're right. I think we may approach that at times when we put whether it's a president or somebody else on a pedestal, and we think they can do no wrong, and we're going to follow them whatever they say, uh, without deifying them, maybe. But in the first century, it would have been common for the emperor to have a be deified or quasi deity and actually to be worshipped. And John is clear, no, that is outright idolatry. And that's why Revelation begins with the vision of God and the Lamb on the throne. There is nobody else worthy of worship, no other human being, not even angelic being, nothing in heaven or earth To worship anything else on heaven and earth in place of God and the Lamb is outright idolatry. And I think, sometimes a lot of people. I like what you said, that the parallels aren't exact. A lot of times people say, "Oh, America is just a modern day Rome." Well, not quite. There are similarities and parallels, but there are some differences. And the other one being, while persecution at this time was not empire wide or official, most of the persecution would have been at a local level for local authorities in the cities and provinces keen to keep favor with Rome and show their loyalty with Rome. It wasn't the emperor who was enforcing worship and going into these cities and enforcing, doling out persecution or something like that. Most of that was happening at a local level, and it wasn't widespread yet. So John only mentions one person so far who has been put to death for his faith, a man named Antipas in Pergamum. There may have been some others, but that's the only one John mentions. But he certainly sees there's more coming as things start to heat up. So that's another difference. At least uh, I don't, I speak personally, I don't ever feel in danger of losing my life for my faith yet living in the United States of America. And we do have some measure of freedom of religious expression. And I can go to church every Sunday and I don't have to worry about that. So there are some differences that we need to be aware of when we look at the book of Revelation and compare it to today. So that I know I'm kind of getting into what we might talk about later, but I talked about one of the purposes of Revelation was a shock out of complacency and compromise. Is that might be the message for a lot of North American Christians, not so much comforting someone who's persecuted. And it's not that a lot of us might don't have to give up and sacrifice things. I've known Americans who have lost family members, and their family wants nothing to do with them because they've come to faith. That's certainly a sacrifice and a form of persecution. But uh, the at least it's not quite like the first century, where in some of these cities to speak up for your faith, to have a faithful witness, would have had rather serious consequences.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's going to be impossible to avoid talking about that here soon. But I
Right.
do want to have a couple other things we want to get to here first. The first one is coming to mind here as you're talking about, as we're continuing to talk about the first century context and the churches maybe needing to be shocked out of their complacency. What would that complacency have looked like? I mean, we sort of have the non-letters, if you will, to the churches in Revelation to tell them, and now we get to see what they were each dealing with. But what about the practice of Christianity at the time would have led to, or what type of complacency would it have led to? What is happening within the churches?
Yeah, I think, in my view, it mainly would have been in the area of kind of, I think mainly in the area of compromise, saying, I mean, for some Christians living in the first century and living in these cities, that to be involved in things like trade or textile industry or something like that would have required, uh, in order to maintain connections in your business that would let it survive and make you a living, is it would have required participation in maybe pagan feast or situations of honoring the gods because they were responsible for your well-being. So it would have been easy, I think, perhaps for some to say, well, I need to feed my family, and I need to make a living. And so it's possible. And some of the church, the seven messages mention a couple groups or false teachers. They very well may have been teaching, well, you can worship God and the Lamb and still give your allegiance to Rome as a good citizen or something like that. So I think the area of compromise and maybe justifying that I'm just being a good citizen, I'm feeding my family, and I can worship God and the Lamb, but I can also worship Caesar at the same time, or show my allegiance. They would maybe wouldn't even have seen it as worship. I can show my allegiance to Rome and to the Roman government, and just maintain peace in that way. So I think that might be the main area where they would just become kind of complacent in their and in the seven messages, John uses the image of a lampstand. And one of the churches he warns you're about ready to lose your lampstand. That is, I think the lampstand stands for their witness. They're witnessing uh, God. They're a witness to God's presence and the reality of who God is and what He has accomplished through Jesus Christ. And that is about ready to go out. They have so compromised with the world that their witness has become dull, and the lamp of their witness is about ready to be extinguished.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It seems to be like an acknowledgement that your faith needs to look so different from the world. Like it is
Right.
just not. It's a completely different sort of. I can't even think of what the word would be, but it's a completely different way of living than what you see around you. And so
Hmm.
anything that starts to make it look like you are just continuing in your ways,
Right.
like the word you just said, dulls that witness.
Yeah.
I think we're at the point now where we need to kind of define. We're going to be talking about sort of these systems that Rome had in place that are different from what we're sort of called to. But in all of that, we need to define what justice and social justice look like, because I think you mentioned multiple times in your essay that John isn't necessarily explicitly talking about social justice or about justice, but he's talking about the system that sort of underpins the
Hmm.
injustice that's seen in society. So, what broadly should we be understanding what justice or social justice looks like as we're continuing in this conversation?
Yeah. I'm probably not the good one for a final definition on this. But as I understand it is a, especially from Revelation, it's a system that treats economically, socially, treats different groups uh, uh, unjustly, at different there's disparity in the way different groups are treated economically, racially, socially, because of the system that's been set up. That kind of a sloppy but rough definition of kind of what social justice, how I understand, or injustice in this case. And
Yeah,
social justice then would be striving for what equality in the way different groups are treated economically, socially.
yeah. I think if there's anything we've learned through the life of this podcast is that the definition of justice resists simplicity.
Yeah.
And so it's continuing to explore, the word I use is pursuit, a pursuit of justice, or
Right.
continuing to sort of pursue that understanding. So I can appreciate that. But when you talk about John not explicitly discussing like injustice or social justice, but talking about the system that's underneath, can you dive a little more into what that system includes? It seemed like there were a bunch of different pieces that were part of the puzzle.
Yeah. So to just back up a little bit, the two things that I noticed when I read Revelation, when I was originally asked to write a paper that ended up in that book, Social Justice in the New Testament, I was originally asked to write that paper and present it at an academic conference, and I started reading Revelation. I thought, oh no, what have I done agreeing to do this? For two reasons. Number one, there's nothing in it like you find in James or in Jesus' teaching of concern for the poor. And James is really explicit in several sections of James' attitude towards the wealthy and the poor. And then it seemed like the poor slaves, for example, those in the bottom of the economic rung were equal objects of judgment in some of John's judgment vision. So I began to wonder, well, how can we? In fact, there are a couple of scholars I read that said John in Revelation doesn't have a social justice teaching. Social justice isn't in the book of Revelation. But the more I looked at it, I began to see, it appears to me that while John is not addressing the issue of social justice itself, whether maybe implicitly and explicitly, he's addressing the system that underlies expressions of social injustice. And that would be, in this case, an empire that sets itself up as God and has um, a thirst for economic well-being, a thirst to serve its own ends. It's idolatrous. It will use force to for any means. It will use force to gain um, power, its own exercise of power uh, to promote itself. You find all of that being critiqued, especially in chapter 17 and chapter 18, where you find the most lengthy critique of Babylon, which I think is a code for Rome, the Roman Empire, though it's larger than that. In John's day, it had expression of the Roman Empire. So I think those are some of the things in the system, just the, setting oneself up as absolutizing power, setting oneself up as God, going to any length, even violence and the use of force to exercise power and to keep one's position, a thirst for economic thirst for goods and wealth. All of that is what John critiques, and to me seems to lie behind the kind of expressions of injustice that you'd find in a book like James or in Jesus' teaching, for example.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there we could move past really quickly. I
Mm-hmm.
think, like, just internally with my understanding of Christianity and the amount of time that I've had for study, which maybe that's maybe a conversation for another time. But it seems like we could say, oh yeah, these are all things that we're not supposed to do, we're not supposed to care about. Oh yes, I understand that God's the one on the throne and no one else is, and all that. But it's like it feels like there's more depth that we could have to our understanding there. And I'm not entirely sure what question to ask to sort of bring us in that direction. But what what about, I guess, sort of the power that we try to have? I think you talk about self-reliance a decent
Mm-hmm.
amount with Rome and Rome's deal. What does that what does the self-reliance, the pursuit of self-reliance, maybe have us miss with what our relationship with God is supposed to be?
Yeah, I mean, and this is one that, for example, Daniel critiques in his book with Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, which is the model that John is using now, and that is pride or arrogance, is simply uh, refusing to acknowledge one's dependence on God. And I think self-reliance, self-reliance, and it kind of seems like an innocuous term in a way, but self-reliance in terms of uh, all that, for example, in John in Revelation, Rome seeing itself as God and in need, and at one point, John critiques Rome for saying, " sit as a queen. I need nothing." That is the attitude of self-reliance. And that seems rather arrogant and bold, and it is. But it can also happen in more subtle ways when, we do things or set up our own schemes to achieve things and simply leave God out of the picture and refuse to acknowledge our reliance on God Himself. So I think that lies at the heart of a lot of John's critique of Rome and a lot of his critique of this ideology that I think ultimately lies behind expressions of injustice.
Yeah. I think you also talk about it being seductive for the people who are
Mhm.
partnering with Rome or who are coming into relationships with Rome. Is there something specifically you think that, or maybe a couple of things that are like contribute to that seductiveness? Like what are the people being, or not maybe just people, but countries, trade partners, whatnot, being
Mhm.
seduced into? What about this is so alluring, if you will?
Yeah, I think it was simply the promise of wealth and the promise of prosperity that Rome offered is you associate with us and that's what was happening at a local level, the church at Laodicea. They were wealthy, they were prospering off Rome's economy. So I think this seduction is, which is kind of at the heart of this image of a prostitute that John uses. It comes out of the Old Testament. You go back to some of the Old Testament text, and the prostitute is seducing other nations into its unjust and idolatrous economic practices. So I think a lot of it was uh, uh, the temptation to gain wealth and prosperity through what Rome offered and what they promised, at the expense, obviously, then of being involved in this idolatrous economic system, the system that was unjust and simply was set up to benefit Rome itself.
Yeah. Can you expand a little bit more on what that injustice in the economic system would have looked like? Like how is the system set up in a way I think that you would maybe describe as exploitative of certain groups?
Yeah. One good example, I think, is back in chapter 6, in the third seal, the third horse in chapter 6. And John sees a horse and the rider's holding a scale, which was an economic image. And this, you have this in that the in that seal. There's a John hears a voice, and it says so much. I can't remember the amounts off the top of my head, but it's denarius or whatever for a quart of barley, and so much for wheat, and don't touch the oil and wine. And what I think this is a picture of Rome's of the injustice and the imbalance of Rome's economy because of their thirst of knowledge. And what was, I think, going on is, I'll start with that voice, don't touch the oil and wine. Some have said, oh, that goes back to an edict by Domitian or whatever. I think what is going on is this is ironic. The two things, wheat and barley, the two things that are necessary for sustaining life, they're staples, they're necessary, are so exorbitantly priced is only the wealthy could afford them. John doesn't say that, but that seems to be the implication. It would take a day's wage to buy enough wheat to feed one person. And you don't have anything left over for your family, you don't have anything for rent or whatever. It's so exorbitantly priced that, and probably the picture is at a time of famine, things are so out of whack that nobody could afford these. But don't touch the oil and wine. Oil and wine, some have mistakenly said those are for the wealthy. No, they weren't. They would have been available to anybody. But the problem was oil and wine aren't necessary. They're not staples, but they were lucrative for trade with Rome. And what was probably going on is a lot of the provinces that belonged to the Roman Empire, they were likely using their fields to grow oil and wine, grapes and olive trees, because that would have been more lucrative for trade with Rome. While the staples that they could have been growing, like wheat and barley, are now in low supply, and during a time of famine, they will be so exorbitantly priced nobody can afford them. So I think that's a picture of that seal is kind of a judgment on Rome's economy to show when Rome thirst for when everything centers on Rome and their thirst for wealth and prosperity, and when everything goes into Rome, then it's their people that are reliant on Rome. They're the ones that end up suffering
Yeah.
because all the farmers they're growing whatever Rome thirsts for and they want. That's what they're growing, oil and wine. But then the staples that are not as probably as lucrative now, they're in short supply, and during a time like famine, they're going to be so high priced, nobody's going to be, especially the poor, are going to suffer greatly.
Yeah, the term cash crops came to mind as I was
Yeah,
reading through that section of
yeah.
it's what is going to bring money in to use rather than what do we need to
Uh-huh.
grow to to sustain our lives. And it was
Sure.
interesting. I don't remember if this was in your writing or in the study notes in my Bible, but just it seems like uh, that Rome was importing wheat, or that wheat was being
Hmm.
imported rather than grown in the empire, and
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
the land that maybe would have or at one time was used for the wheat and barley had been turned into
Hmm.
places to
Right.
grow vines and
Right.
olive
Right.
trees and things like that. And so it's like you've sort of grown yourself into this position of uh, feeling like you're going to be secure, and that things have been secure until something happens where it's no longer the
Hmm.
case.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then uh, the ones who don't have problems with that are the wealthy, who are able to continue to afford that, but the ones who do are the people who don't have
Hmm.
the ability to continue to afford that.
Right.
I'm curious what the relationship between the provinces and Rome was like, because I feel like you just said that the provinces were trading with Rome, which I think is different from how I would understand what I would think of the way things work today. Like, I think
Hmm.
maybe it's just a completely different way that countries are thought of, but it doesn't seem like, I mean, I guess resources could be distributed inequitably or unjustly inside of a country, but all this, I guess, getting to the point of what was the relationship between the provinces and Rome? Like, did Rome see the provinces as part of the empire in a different way than it saw itself?
Hmm. Yeah. Again, I probably can't answer that question in much detail and really well as far as some of the details of the relationship. But basically, the provinces were set up as Rome, as Rome grew and increased its empire, it kept control of that through provinces. And most likely the relationship between the provinces and Rome differed a little bit depending on how easily they gave in and to Rome's conquest. And usually there were similar to governors or something set up over the provinces. And you know I personally don't know how exactly how they kept in touch or how closely the emperor monitored what was going on in the empire in the provinces. I'm unsure of that. I'm not sure how they. I mean, obviously there was um, benefit in demonstrating your loyalty to Rome. And like I said, a lot of the local authorities they'd want to make sure that they curried favor with Rome and showed they're showing their appropriate loyalty. Uh, but other than that, I'm not, especially economically, I'm not sure. Um, Sometimes you'd have things like the emperor uh, doling out finances for the building of a temple in his honor. Sometimes cities were rich enough they could do their own. They could build temples on their own in honor of the emperor and things like that. Um, but I mean there was often financial benefit for showing your favor to Rome and showing that you were loyal to a loyal citizen or loyal city or whatever to Rome. But I'm unsure how was food doled out or anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I don't know that I expected a full on history lesson or anything like that, but it's just a curious
Yeah.
question, I think, to understand, since these churches are in a province and
Hmm.
maybe not, they're not in or around Rome, how that maybe would have impacted things.
But yeah, I mean, they would have considered all that was Roman territory, that was the Roman Empire, and to live inside of it. Again, it wasn't the emperor enforcing things, but to live inside of it, you're expected to, we might say, live like a good citizen and show your allegiance to Rome. And it's usually the local authorities that were trying to ensure that happened.
Yeah. I think I want to turn now to starting to think about how this applies to us today, or how we
Hmm.
understand application. But I want to do that maybe a little backwards and
Yeah.
go the opposite direction first in understanding or thinking about how John used Babylon to refer to Rome. It almost feels like it's us looking back at Rome, trying to map on. It feels like there could be a similar sort of
Hmm.
operation in play, if you will. So
Yeah.
how, because it doesn't seem like Babylon would necessarily map perfectly onto Rome. but he's still using Babylon as sort of this maybe key phrase to talk about
Hmm.
Rome. How would John at the time and maybe the churches have understood Babylon and how that looked when we're when sort of comparing the two time periods?
Yeah. And I think you're right, Eric, that the two weren't obviously identical, but I think Babylon sort of becomes an image for an empire, number one, an empire that is godless and idolatrous and oppressive of God's people, and uh, and sets itself up as God, sets itself up also by using force. And that seems to be, again, all of that seems to be John's primary critique of Rome in chapter 17 and 18. So I think the idea, uh, if the shoe fits, wear it. So if all of those are true, any nation that's idolatrous, it sets itself up as God, it's arrogant and proud, it is and self-reliant, it um, establishes its reign and rule at all cost, it's oppressive of God's people, uh, then there is Babylon. And for John, the Roman Empire was in a sense, we might say the spirit of Babylon. What makes Babylon Babylon is now resurfacing in Rome. So Babylon becomes kind of a perfect uh, kind of lens with which to see Rome now because it's doing the same thing.
Yeah. I think when we start to think about what that looks like today and understanding maybe our current situation, for the most part, I think Americans listening to the podcast here, I'll lay out some of what I think, and then you can tell me what you resonate
Yeah.
with or what you feel like I'm missing. But it seems like one of the fundamental differences between our current country, I guess, as a whole versus Rome, if we're thinking about that using Babylon as a lens, is that in some sense we still have this narrative, maybe myth, if you will, of being connected to God and being led through God and through Christianity, being founded in Christian principles and whatnot. And so it seems like there are corners of Christianity maybe that want to continue to see the United States as maybe being part of that Babylon and something that we need to fight against, while also trying to maintain that this is a Christian nation. And it seems that just on as maybe our starting point feels like a break between the exact mapping on, if you will, or the maybe clearer lens that John sees between the two versus what we would see today. I
Mhm.
guess, do you have any thoughts on that perspective as our starting point here?
Yeah, and what I think too is when any nation tries to see, I think today when they think, oh, we're divinely chosen, we're God's nation, we're a Christian nation or whatever. The problem is then it's easy then to overlook, kind of fall back within the trap of, like we said, then you're not aware of the crisis that you face, or I'm not aware of where Babylon. And I'd be the last one to say the United States and Babylon are equal, or the United States and Rome are the same. No, if anyone lived in the Roman Empire, I doubt they'd make that draw that conclusion. However, on the other hand, it's easy to miss where there might be those parallels between Babylon and Rome, and I think too is wherever we see, whether it's the United States or any other nation, I think we need to get away from finding it's this nation or that nation is Babylon or there's Babylon, but wherever we see idolatrous, this self-reliant, setting oneself up as God, absolutizing power, um, uh, uh, maintaining that power at all cost, and oppressing God's people, even oppressing the poor and perpetrating injustice. There's Babylon, whatever that might look like. And I think probably we would see that all over the world.
Yeah.
And I think the danger is, seeing, well, the United States is a Christian nation chosen by God, uh, it's easy then to overlook because we're just not thinking that. It's easy to overlook where we may be falling into that trap of, Babylon may be surfacing in places in our world, our culture, our economy, in the United States, our treatment of the poor.
Yeah. I think what that makes me think of is certainly the stream of evangelicalism I grew up in, and maybe some would say every stream of evangelicalism. There is some sort of narrative of a cultural uh, tendency towards persecution of Christians
Hmm.
that leads churches to feel like we are being persecuted. I think in a way wanting to maintain that narrative, I guess, if you will. And one of the things I read from you that felt like it could be applicable today is a reading from below versus a reading from above. So, perspective from the marginalized versus perspective from the wealthy. Because, as you mentioned, with some of the churches in Asia Minor at the time, they were wealthier churches. They weren't necessarily being persecuted in a way that, or they wouldn't have felt the injustice in a way necessarily that a poorer non-Christian would have necessarily at the
Hmm.
time. Is that something we can bring into today of thinking through where do we stand positionally in terms of looking at it from above versus a from below perspective?
Yeah, and I think that's why I think for North American Christians, I think Revelation is more of a challenge to read it from above. That is, from a position of I'm trying to think of the word. I just drew a blank. The word you just used, and not marginalized, but uh, now we're in a position of um, socio-economic um, privilege. We're in a more privileged position, and again, I would never ever diminish the suffering that some American Christians have undergone for their faith. But on the other hand, at least the Christians that I come in contact with and the churches that I belong to, uh, you know, persecution, especially in terms of the danger of losing one's life, is simply not a reality. And for a lot of Christians, and I have to confess myself, I don't even suffer verbal threats or verbal abuse or the danger of getting beaten up or something like that because of my faith. It's just, and maybe some of it's because I teach at a seminary too, but I'm in a different context where I rub shoulders with non-Christians and they know I'm a Christian and I'm vocal about that. So that then what does Revelation say to me? Well, maybe if I'm reading it more from above, it should serve more as a warning to me to make sure, thinking in terms of social injustice, am I somehow the cause of or supporting causes of or privy to the suffering that other people are going through? Am I somehow in danger of compromising my faithful witness because of the way I live, because of the way I act, because of what I say? And I'm not saying yes, I am, but I think when I read the Book of Revelation, and a lot of this came too when I remember when I first taught. One of my first teaching gigs was at a large Christian college on the East Coast, and we had a lot of students, international students. And I remember one time a conversation with a girl from Nepal, and listening to her story, and I thought, you know what? I can't claim that I undergo any form. I'm not saying nobody does in the United States, but for me, I cannot claim that I undergo any kind of form of persecution after listening to her story and listening to the stories of other. I remember having just thinking in terms of suffering and persecution. My first year I taught at Denver Seminary, a student from India who was there, and his family, because he became a Christian and decided to go to seminary, his family wanted nothing to do with it. They disowned him, basically. They treated him like he was dead, kind of had a funeral for him. And, I hear stories like that, and I think, man, I'm not. I remember when I was a student, one of the seminary students from Vietnam that had to escape for his life to the United States so he could come to seminary. And I hear stories like that, and I think I'm not that I can't even I can't even wrap my mind around that. I don't. That's not a reality for me. I don't experience that. So I just more and more I stopped reading Revelation as a comfort to me, and it is. Yeah, it's a comfort of because we experience other forms of suffering in the forms of disease and broken marriages and relationships and financial hardship. So yeah, the book of Revelation is a comfort and a hope because it envisions a new creation that's about to come. But when I think of persecution, that is the martyrdom that Revelation envisioned for God's people who would maintain their faithful witness in this hostile Roman environment, is I can't say that that's a reality for me. But what is a reality for me are the other five churches that were becoming complacent or compromising. And so that I want to ask, where am I in danger of compromising my faith? Or when it comes to social injustice, where am I in danger of being involved with systems or supporting systems, unknowingly or not, that perpetrate social injustice? And then what can I do to address that?
Yeah. I think my last question here is going to be far too large than the couple minutes we're going to have for it, but it does seem like talking about Revelation, we need to talk about what new creation looks like or
Yeah.
what sort of is coming for Christians. Because I think when people think about Revelation, that is the maybe the sole thing they think about Revelation's message is what the
Mhm.
end times look like. So as briefly as we'll have time here for, I guess, what can people think about as they approach Revelation about thinking about what new creation looks like, what is sort of coming in the future for Christians, and how everything we've just talked about applies to what that new creation will look like?
Yeah. So uh, I'm so glad you asked that because I think that's kind of the heart of the book. In the past, and movements like the Left Behind series have perpetrated focus more on the Great Tribulation and that we're going to be raptured, and then the millennium. And in my view, the goal of the entire book is it's moving towards Revelation 21 and 22, which is a vision of God's people and God and the Lamb on a new earth. So, new creation, new earth. So, what that means is the hope of God's people is a very physical earthly existence. And to go back to Genesis 1 and 2, that's the way God created us. The story of the Bible is not God created Adam and Eve to live on earth. They sinned, and God says, well, that didn't work. So I'm going to send Jesus Christ to die for sins. We'll take them to heaven, live happily ever after. That's not the Bible storyline. The story is, how is God going to fix what went wrong in Genesis 1 through 3? And that is restoring us in physical, resurrected bodies to live on a physical earth. Revelation doesn't answer a lot of questions that we have. What's that going to look like? What age are we going to be? Will the technology be whenever Christ decides to return? Is that where the technology will be? I don't know. But the main point is that Revelation has a vision of a physical new creation and God's people living on that in meaningful activity. You have this vision of the nations coming and bringing their glory into it. So now there's going to be meaningful physical activity on a new earth as God intended it. So you think about it, and I always think of it this way, and it doesn't work for everybody, but I love the outdoors and I live in Colorado and I love the mountains. And whenever I'm in the mountains, I often think, man, can you imagine a world like this that's stripped of all the effects of sin, a world where no cancer, no disease, no divorces, no broken relationships, no school shootings, no injustice. That's the world that Revelation promises in 21 and 22. And it's not just the physical nature of it. It's this is a world full of love and justice and all the things that plague this world and make it so difficult at times is non-existent when God comes to recreate things. And for me, that world is worth sacrificing this one. When Jesus says you need to give up, take up your cross and follow me, lose this life in order to gain a life to come. I'm not sure I'm willing to do that if it's just entails going up to heaven and floating around. But if it's a new creation, a new earth, if it's this earth renewed and transformed and stripped of all the effects of sin, man, I'm more than willing to sacrifice for that. The other thing too is, as I said, the new creation is a world filled with righteousness and justice and love and the economic disparity that characterizes this world is gone. There's complete justice, no more injustice. What I think that says about today is that the world should be able to look at your life and mine and the church and see a taste of that. They should, yeah, an imperfect one, but the world should be able to look at the church and look at your life and mine and see a glimpse of what that world should look like. And that's another reason to advocate for and to pursue justice in this world, not just because that's trendy and that's what the world's calling for, but because that's what's going to characterize the new creation. And the Revelation says we are kings and priests. That is, we are witnesses to the reality of a new creation in the future. So people should be able to look at the church, should be able to look at us personally and see a glimpse of what life in the new creation would be like. And part of that is a place of justice, a place of love, a place of security and peace. And however imperfectly in this world, we should be modeling that to some degree.
I think I will say amen. That it sounds like a good place for us to stop our conversation here today.
Good.
So thank you, Dr. Mathewson, for joining me today here. I really appreciated that conversation.
Hey, thank you, Eric. I really enjoyed talking with you, appreciated your questions, and I love any opportunity I can get to talk about the book of Revelation. So thanks.
Hey, it's Eric. Thanks for watching the Biblical Justice Resources podcast here on YouTube. If you found this episode helpful, insightful, or informative, check out another one of our videos, subscribe for more, or share this with a friend. If you're looking for more resources on how to pursue biblical justice, head over to our website at biblicaljusticeresources.com or check out the show notes below for more links.